afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our Faculty Unionization Town Hall and conversation with Bill Herbert and Gary Rhodes. My name is Corinne Hyde, and I am a professor of clinical education in the Russier School of Education. Unionization in higher education has become a critical issue, especially as union membership among faculty continues to grow, with a 56% increase in the private sector since 2012. Today's conversation is particularly important as we face challenges like job security, compensation, and working conditions for non-tenure track faculty. Unionization efforts like ours are part of a larger national movement to ensure that faculty voices are heard and their rights are protected. Our town hall today is structured around three key topics, each with its own faculty facilitator. We will cover first the national context for organizing, which will be facilitated by Amanda Goodrich from the Keck School of Medicine. Then we will cover contract issues and faculty wins, which will be facilitated by Steve Desir from the School of Education. And then we will focus on combating anti-union campaigns and messaging, which will be facilitated by Renee Smith-Maddox from the School of Social Work. And in addition to these facilitators, we are fortunate to have two other distinguished panelists, Laura Castañeda from Annenberg and Jennifer Crawford from the School of Education, who will be sharing their insights throughout the conversation. Each section will be recorded and made available after the event, so you'll have the opportunity to revisit these discussions later. We're also honored to have two distinguished guests with us today. Bill Herbert, a distinguished lecturer at Hunter College and executive director of the National Center for the Study of Collective Bargaining in Higher Education, brings a wealth of knowledge on labor history, faculty unionization, and electronic privacy. Gary Rhodes, a professor of higher education at the University of Arizona, focuses on academic labor and the restructuring of higher education institutions, and he previously served as general secretary of the AAUP. Their expertise will be instrumental as we examine the broader national context and the specific challenges and successes of faculty unionization. So the goals for our discussion today are clear. Number one, we want to better understand the national landscape for organizing non-tenure track faculty and the implications for higher education. Number two, we want to explore the significant wins that faculty unions have achieved in areas like job security, compensation, and professional development. And number three, we want to discuss effective strategies for combating anti-union campaigns, mitigating retaliation, and building support within our institutions and the broader community. So with that, I will turn it over to Amanda Goodrich to begin our first section on the national context for organizing. So thank you all so much for being here today, and I cannot wait to hear this discussion.
Welcome, everybody. My name is Amanda Goodrich. I am part-time teaching faculty at the Keck School of Medicine. So we begin our conversation today by exploring the national context for organizing non-tenure track faculty, with union representation growing, particularly in the private sector, which is up 56% since 2012. Understanding how faculty can successfully organize is more critical than ever. In this section, we'll address some of the biggest challenges, including the divide between full-time and part-time adjuncts, the legal obstacles posed by decisions like yeshiva, and how collective bargaining has reshaped governance at universities. We're fortunate to have Gary Rhodes, a professor of higher education at the University of Arizona and former general secretary of the AAUP, and Bill Herbert, distinguished lecturer at the Hunter College and executive director of the National Center for the Study of Collective Bargaining in Higher Education. Together, they bring unparalleled expertise in academic labor and faculty rights, and they'll guide us through the evolving landscape of higher education organizing. So if you all want to take it away with your PowerPoint, that would be great.
Hi, everyone. So my name is Bill Herbert, and I run the National Center for the Study of Collective Bargaining in Higher Education and the Professions. We're a labor management research center at Hunter College. We've been around since 1972. We run an annual conference and conduct regular research regarding collective bargaining among faculty, postdocs, graduate assistants, and undergraduates. We published a 2024 directory earlier this month. The directory includes data regarding over 900 collective bargaining relationships in higher education, as well as hyperlinks to 813 contracts, which the intention of this is to provide data and information directly to people who are interested in it. And so using the hyperlinks is sometimes the best evidence of what can be accomplished through collective bargaining. And I believe the link is in in the materials, and I encourage you to download the directory. One of the things we found one of the things we do is we keep track of data. We keep track of unionization among faculty really on a weekly basis, tracking what's happening in unionization efforts. And this involves filing of petitions at the NLRB and elsewhere, and then we keep track of vote tallies, et cetera. In addition to the fact that, as pointed out already by Amanda, is that there's been a 56% growth among non-tenure track faculty. But if you see it in figure 4 before you, you see that primarily collective bargaining among faculty has primarily been in the public sector, really until the past 10 years. And you see an incredibly large growth, although it's only 8.2%, that's still 56% of what it was beforehand. A lot of that has to do with the fact that in 1980, the Supreme Court rendered a decision in a case called Yeshiva University, which said that tenure track faculty who are engaged in shared governance are managerial and therefore don't have the right to unionize. Since that time, as we know, there's been a massive restructuring among faculty, to most positions now being non-tenure track faculty. And so now we see in the past 10 years a very large growth in unionization among the non-tenure track faculty. Now, this is just 12 examples of schools around the country that have non-tenure track bargaining units at this time. So you have both the University of Chicago and Harvard have now unionized among non-tenure track, as well as NYU, and look at Duke University in North Carolina, in the Boston area, Boston University, and Tufts in Northeastern. In the Midwest, Washington University and St. Louis University, and then in Louisiana, Tulane University, one of the most recent schools that have unionized. And then right near you is Marymount University, where the vote was just taken just last week of the visiting professors to unionize. So what's happening at USC is very much a part of a national trend, and you are very much a part of that national trend. So I also want to point out that there is, because of this massive growth in unionization among non-tenure track faculty around the country, both in the private and public sector, there's been a growing literature with respect to it. And one of the books that we want to encourage you to consider looking at is the book Continued Faculty and the Remaking of Higher Education, which Gary and I and many others around the country contributed to. But we also have Adriana Cazar's and her colleague's book, The Gig Academy, which is also an excellent book to consider. And then the other two books are Professors in the Gig Economy, which is about, again, chapters based on unionization efforts around the country. And the last book is Adjunct Underclass, which is really about seeing the role of continued faculty in a larger spectrum. So that's what I wanted to just cover in the introduction, and I will now turn it over to Gary.
Thanks, Bill. And you can actually keep up the book slide if you would, because I think it's a really useful resource for folks. So I'm delighted to be here as well. As Amanda said, and Corinne before her, I'm a professor of higher education here at the University of Arizona. I've been studying academic labor since the early 1990s. Wrote a book based on, at that time, 211 collective bargaining agreements nationally, called Managed Professionals. And I've got a new book coming out based on 506 collective bargaining agreements and organizing campaigns around the country. It's coming out in April, and it's called Organizing Professionals, Academic Employees Negotiating a New Academy. Now, as Bill said, and Amanda before and Corinne before that, this is really an unprecedented expansion of and energy in the academic labor movement, which, to give you an idea of how dramatic the change is, in the book Bill referenced, Contingent Faculty and the Remaking of Higher Ed, most of those contributors are contingent faculty themselves. I'm a contributor. I'm not a contingent faculty member, but I'm going to tell you the title of of my chapter in there sort of captures what's happening in this national movement. And the title is From the Margins to the Center. So for quite some time, contingent faculty, both part-time and full-time, have been the numerical majority of faculty in the US. So when I started out 100 years ago in the early 80s, maybe 25% of the faculty were part-time, were adjunct. Full-time non-tenure track was not even really much of a thing at that point, maybe less than 5%. By now, and actually by the 2000s, it's more like roughly half are part-time and another 20+% are full-time non-tenure track of all faculty. But what has happened in just the last decade and a half, as Bill has indicated, and I'll just point to another resource where a lot of Bill's work is published. It's called the Journal of Collective Bargaining in the Academy, which is an online open source resource, so there's no paywalls or anything. And every couple of years, Bill and his colleagues at the National Center put out a really valuable analysis of what's been happening lately, dating back to 2016 and then a few years after that. So it's a great resource for seeing the kind of explosion of organizing that Bill's talking about. Primarily, as has been said, in the private sector, in the independent sector, not the proprietary for-profits, but the private independents. And the origins of that explosion has been part-time and full-time non-tenure track faculty, and then subsequently graduate employees and postdocs, again, in the private sector as well as in the public sector. And so now it's not only that folks like yourselves are the numerical majority, it's that you are really in the center of, and the vanguard, I argue, of the academic labor movement and kind of the labor movement nationally. And you can think of this in other sectors where groups that have been sort of left on the margins or treated like they're on the margins have become central in organizing. One of the things that I say, and this sort of foreshadows some conversations we'll have later today, one of the things I always say as I speak to groups of contingent faculty who are organizing is that you are contingent only to management. You are not contingent to the students that you teach, to the professions in which you work, and in which you operate and participate. For them, you're central. And part of the organizing, at the center of the organizing, is a demand for respect, which is really at the center of all organizing. Respect, given the central role that you play, even though, like the terminology that gets used, whether it's adjunct faculty for part-time faculty, they're not adjunct, they are central. Or contingent faculty for full-time non-tenure track, again, not just really central to the work of the organization, and central to the students and to the public. And I think that's really important for all of us to understand, and it's at the forefront of a lot of the campaigns. One of the most common mantras that sort of captures this of the contingent faculty labor movement, which I think you all have really constructed and gotten into the public domain in a way that really resonates with people, is that faculty's working conditions are students' learning conditions. And so if we're in exploitative situations, that's not good for our students. It's not only not good for us, it prevents us or inhibits us or makes it more difficult for us to do the work that we're capable of doing and want to do to serve the students, to serve the professions that we work in. And I think that's really at the center of the organizing, and you can trace the articulation of that mantra really to the rise of contingent faculty organizing. So I'll stop there.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just gonna kind of go into a couple of questions, some questions I had for you.
Mm-hmm.
What are the biggest challenges that you've found in organizing non-tenure track faculty, particularly with the divides between full-time and part-time adjunct faculty? And how have unions addressed these divides in their institution? I know we're seeing, I personally have seen a lot of that. I know I'm sure I've heard others that are organizing for USC have as well. Um, you know, the not just full-time and part-time teaching faculty, but as we were kind of talking about earlier today, clinical faculty versus research faculty versus part-time versus adjunct. And there's a lot of but I'm not like them. They're different from me. Why would I join a union with them? How have unions addressed these divides in other institutions?
One thing to keep in mind is those kind of divides exist in all industries. And so this is nothing new in terms of there being people viewing themselves as being different and therefore have questions. I think the key issue, the key thing that unions are doing is by ensuring that people understand that the people involved, the employees, that their interests are the same. Interest in job security, in compensation, in professional development, in discrimination, in all various topics. Everyone is affected in very similar ways. And once there's an understanding and work towards building upon those issues, people will see the bridges between themselves and others. And one of the important things is to constantly be working towards getting people to understand those things. And one issue is something to consider is the kind of the pecking order and being mindful of that and being respectful of that in the sense that making sure that everyone is welcome and that everyone's a part. That forming the union is a part is a process of an organic process that brings people together in terms of greater unity, and that is built by this understanding of their interests being in a very similar way. They have similar interests.
So I'll piggyback on that and say, first of all, so as I indicated, I've been studying this stuff and been engaged in as well as a participant for quite a few years. And one of the things that I've seen over time, especially since the mid 2000s, and again, I'm going to attribute this to the role of contingent faculty in helping colleagues understand that we're all, as Bill said, we're all employees in an organization which operates in ways that exploit our labor and put us in situations that are not optimal for our professional work. And what I've seen over time, and again, if you go to some of the data that Bill provides, in the private sector, but in the public as well, there has been an increase in the number of combined units, so-called combined units of full and part-time faculty over time. And so while these divisions continue, the sort of perspective that I bring to it is they are lessening as over time faculty are realizing that we are in this together. A couple of examples that I use in that chapter that I referred to and also in my book is that during the pandemic, there had been some coordinated negotiating so that the more secure members of the faculty, whether that's tenure stream or full-time non-tenure track, negotiated with their management to protect part-time adjunct faculty positions during the pandemic. Sometimes that had to do with layoffs. Sometimes, as at the University of Oregon, it had to do with furloughs. And so the union negotiated, no, we need to create a floor to protect the lowest paid employees who among the faculty are adjunct faculty, and we need to create a scale that protects those at the bottom. The other thing I'll say is that one of the main strategies you're engaged in on this panel, and that is, as Bill said, you want everyone to feel included. So that means on bargaining teams, on organizing committees, in all the sort of internal structures of the union, you have representation of people from those various segments, however they get divided. Sometimes it's status of employment, like full and part-time faculty. Sometimes it's by the type of work that they're doing, like you were saying, Amanda, in the Keck School. Sometimes it's by the identities, and all of these are important, by the identities of the groups, whether that's BIPOC faculty or even broken down to Latinx. There's a Latinx caucus, there's an African American caucus, right? And you have actually a fabulous model in the California Faculty Association, which is for the Cal State system, where over 2 decades, and I've actually written about this, but they've had a series of great leaders who have written about, and the article is in that Journal of Collective Bargaining in the Academy, where I interview a couple of the African American leaders. One of them is the current president of the union, who talk about how they consciously and intentionally constructed these caucuses. And sort of the first step was adjunct faculty. We need to have our part-time faculty need our own caucus. We need to be included at the table in all these different organizational structures. Then women, then African American, then Latinx, then Asian Pacific Islander, then LGBTQ plus, right? And so it doesn't just happen accidentally. It's an intentional, inclusive practice that ensures that the voices are at the table and can feel like that their input is valued and plays a role in the decision making of the union, so that it's not just being run by one group, and there's a variety of other groups that say, well, we don't get listened to, and so everything they're negotiating for has to do with this group versus that group. So you're already doing that in this little meeting, right? You've got representation of different status of employment, different schools, different types of work, different identities. That's really smart.
And to pick up on what Gary said, I just want to point out that one of the important things in terms of getting to collective bargaining and getting once the union is in effect is the larger the unit of workers in the bargaining unit, the stronger it is at the bargaining table. That by having a large unit, or sometimes referred to as a wall-to-wall unit of contingent faculty, that gives a lot more strength. It sends a message to the employer that this is a much more powerful union than if it was just one group of people at one school, or part-time faculty at one school, but instead it's full-time and part-time spread out throughout the university. Very important message. Just simply that fact will send a message to the university that when they have to go to the bargaining table and they're confronted with proposals from the union, that it's going to be a very strong union. And that's what unity really is involved, the importance of unity in terms of that strength, establishment.
Yeah. Great. So I had a couple of other questions, but in the interest of time, I'm want to open it up to see if anybody else has any questions first, and then if not, I can come back to mine. Laura, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for everyone's contributions. What I've been finding when talking to particularly adjunct faculty is a real fear of retaliation, fear that they won't be asked to return to teach the one class they may teach in the fall or the one class they teach in the spring. How can you, I mean, what do you suggest other than what, we've all been telling them that, that of course retaliation is illegal and et cetera, et cetera.
So I think there's a way to flip that. The fear is real, it's understandable, and it's precisely why you need a union, right? If you are an academic, if you're any kind of an employee, you should not be working in fear of speaking out about your working conditions, about whether they're safe, about whether you need more materials. Like, it's a university. If you're afraid, something's wrong. And so the game is, if you're part of a larger collective, like a union, and here's to the combination of full and part-time faculty. Maybe the part-time faculty are a little less willing to be, the ones who speak to the media. Maybe they're not particularly anxious to do the interview with the newspaper or be seen on a television interview or do a radio show. But if you have a process whereby the concerns of part-time faculty are, bubble up and can be articulated then by folks who feel more secure, that's part of the benefit of being in a collective. Not everybody has to be public. There's all kinds of work to be done, and there's all kinds of protections that come from being part of a larger group, so that you're not just out there on your own, afraid that, wow, if I say anything, there'll be no recourse. And, right now, in effect, you are at-will employees. They don't need any cause. There's no due process for you. They just non-renew you. That's why you need a union, because with a union, you have some level of due process that is in itself a protection, because it makes it more difficult for management to do stuff like fire people. And that's part of the game of negotiating, is to make stuff that we don't want them to do more difficult, because ultimately they'll do what's easiest.
And picking up on that, one of the easiest things to do that's private, which really it has immense impact upon the organizing campaign, which is a private action, which is to sign a card to show that you're supporting the union. That is something that could get submitted to the National Labor Relations Board. That is not something that someone has to become public about. And as Gary was saying, some people can be public, some people can be private. But the other thing, just underscoring what Gary's saying, is that the key aspect, one of the key issues is going to be job security and a grievance arbitration procedure. That basically, this is the whole point of this, is so people feel that degree of security, that they have enforceable rights. And so through a collective bargaining agreement. And so I think that's one of the elements of it. But again, the private action can simply be signing an authorization card that will be then the support for the petition and get to an election. And again, they can then vote, and they can vote in private, because the election is done in private, so that they do not have to disclose whether they vote yay or nay. They can just do it on their own in a private way.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you so much. I think we have time for one more question really quick on this topic. So Jen, if you want to go.
Thank you, Amanda, and thank you, Gary and Bill, for being here today. I had a question about how collective bargaining efforts have reshaped governance structures at universities, particularly speaking with a lot of the more senior, full-time, non-tenure track faculty, which at USC we call research, teaching, clinical, and practice. There is a lot of concern about how unionization efforts would impact what we call now our shared governance structures, which have representation of RTPC or non-tenure track faculty, however, lack some of the power that we've discussed here today.
Yeah, so that's like management 101. Oh, if you do this, you'll compromise the collegial relations that we have and the collegial processes. And then you say, yeah, so collegial that someone's afraid to speak out. So here's the reality of collective bargaining. And I say this as a former general secretary of the AAUP, which is all about shared governance, right? So overwhelmingly, what happens in these agreements is that the senates and those sorts of structures continue. What collective bargaining does, and the AAUP has some statements to this effect. I know you're not organizing with the AAUP, but you can invoke their principles because they're so prominent. A statement to the effect of collective bargaining strengthens established academic structures, right? It doesn't replace them. It doesn't take them over. It strengthens them because it gives them some legal force. So for example, in a collective bargaining agreement, you can negotiate, and again, I got like a whole chapter on that. You can negotiate what's the process for reorganizing programs that will lead to faculty layoffs. Now, what's negotiated in the agreement is the process. And almost always the process runs through a Senate of some sort in a four-year institution. So the big threat that somehow is going to take away the power and the collegiality and the decision-making is wrong. What it does is it makes it a legal requirement for the institution to use and follow that. And we know how institutions often, try to manipulate those structures. So it's not a threat, it's actually an enforcement. The other thing I'll say, and it's what I was saying earlier about who shares in shared governance. So disproportionately in senates, it's people who look like me, right? In a union, you have an opportunity to have a much wider group of folks who have representation and who can have input into various issues that affect the work lives of everyone. So I think that is actually one of the challenges of the established structures. Like whatever representation you have, I'm going to feel pretty comfortable saying that disproportionately there will be people like me making the decisions. But they're not really decisions. They're more like in Pirates of the Caribbean, guidelines, recommendations. With a collective bargaining agreement, they have more legal force.
And for those who are not in shared governance, who are not invited into the circle, collective bargaining is a governance structure.
Yes.
Basically, it's a governance structure for the majority who are working in part-time positions. And so for them, this creates a whole process. It's shared in the sense that you have to negotiate it. Management's there, the faculty are there, but it creates a structured governance that, again, unlike traditional shared governance, has enforceability. And so for the majority who are not a part of the traditional shared governance structure, they're going to be able through unionization to have a governance structure that will be in the context of collective bargaining.
This is really great. Thank you so much. In the interest of time, we're going to move on to the next topic, which is contract issues and faculty wins. So I'm going to pass it over to Steve Dessier from the School of Education.
Great, thank you so much. This has been quite an educational conversation, and I'm excited to have this next conversation thinking about contract issues and faculty wins. As a scholar of higher education, someone who studies how universities are organized, I recognize that in many ways, institutions are big bureaucracies that are slow to move. And in many ways, many of the equity issues that we've seen addressed in higher education have come from external forces. Unions happening to be one that can exert pressure on universities to address issues that they might, drag their feet on in many cases. So I'm looking forward to the next set of questions, which are really going to encourage us to think about what faculty unions have done for faculty, especially at those recent cases where folks have been organizing at private universities. Mm-hmm. So I guess my first question for you is, could you maybe walk us through what have been some of the contributions that faculty unions have made for non-tenure track faculty, especially as we think about some of the institutions that you just named that have been organizing on private university campuses? I've been a student at a couple of those, and so I've been kept abreast of those changes at places like NYU. And so I'm curious your perspective on what that has meant for the lives of non-tenure track faculty.
So Steve, would it be okay if I share my share my slides again?
Go ahead.
Okay. So first, remember that in collective bargaining, there are mandatory subjects to negotiations, and all bargaining can be different depending on what you, the faculty, want. Is the first thing that is developed in terms of proposals for collective bargaining. So each contract is different depending on starting with what faculty want at that particular institution. But there are certain core things that are common in contracts. One, of course, is compensation, increasing compensation, and doing comparatives based on other institutions. And our directory will provide you with that kind of variations that exist. And I think that in the materials for you is a summary of some of those findings that I think are important. But job security is very important as well as a promotional ladder for non-tenure track faculty. And then things like healthcare, childcare, discrimination, harassment, and particularly enforcement of prohibitions, and then grievance arbitration to be able to enforce those provisions. And so these all get codified in what's known as a collective bargaining agreement. It's a written contract, right, that's enforceable through a grievance arbitration process. It involves compromises that are reached between the parties at the particular institution. And again, it could be vary from contract to contract, the actual results. Generally, first contracts are generally shorter than agreements for mature relationships, but the contracts make things transparent. And that's an important element about the organizing, is for people to understand that through collective bargaining and a contract, all the terms that are applicable to everyone is available. You can see it through it transparent to a contract, as opposed to it being school by school with different kinds of things that are going on. It allows for there to be a much greater people being much more aware of what's transpiring throughout the university. And then the other is that the enforcement component through grievance arbitration. So this is the first contract language I want to show you is from the University of Hawaii. And this is just one contract language. It's a very significant, great victory. We've had people from the University of Hawaii speak at our conference. And this is the conversion article that's in their contract, which provides for the conversion of non-tenure track faculty positions into tenure track positions. This is the goal everyone wants, but it's not as common as in other places. But in Hawaii, they were able to accomplish it. And just an example, a conversion language, not a promotion ladder for non-tenure track, but actually a conversion language. The other is, and I think it's a good comparative, is NYU, the NYU contract. So I have a couple of provisions that I want to share with you that NYU, the adjunct unit at NYU was able to accomplish. And this is just the table of contents in terms of the contract. So you see the things about academic freedom is in there, reappointment language, personal files, professional development fund, health and safety, compensation, discipline, annuity plans for retirement, health insurance, and a grievance arbitration procedure. These are all just from the table of contents. The agreement is rather long, so looking at the table of contents is easier to summarize what's in there. But I want to highlight a couple of provisions. So one is the professional development fund. And so under this contract, the university has designated $200,000 for professional development for non-tenure track faculty, a sizable amount that can then be distributed to throughout the university. And that's one thing that can be accomplished is professional development fund, which is really important for non-tenure track faculty in terms of research, presenting papers at conferences, and also improving their teaching skills, all through professional development paid for by the university, negotiated by the union, and resulting in an enforceable provision of the contract. The second provision, and this is something that I think Gary is going to pick up on, and I think is really something that is important to underscore, is that so many of the campaigns that we're watching around the country involving faculty, graduate assistants, postdocs, in the unionization efforts has been the issue of discrimination and harassment. Discrimination in various forms, including race, gender, Title IX issues, sexual harassment. And we see that frequently there's been a very big push for getting language in contracts which are enforceable involving discrimination. And this is just a version of the non-discrimination clause at NYU's contract. And you see that they has a very broad scope of what's prohibited in terms of discrimination. And it applies both to present and future employees. And it's a good example of the kind of language. Again, this is something that's subject to the grievance procedure. So if someone has been discriminated against or harassed, they can utilize the contract to enforce their rights under that. This is something, again, that's very important. And there are other contracts which much more elaborate procedures, but this is the cleanest I could find. It just shows you the kind of things that are prohibited, and then the procedure is through grievance arbitration. And then last, I just want to share with you, again, from the NYU contract, is things that we don't necessarily, that are very important for faculty, particularly contingent faculty. And those are things such as, work-life support programs, childcare, et cetera. And this is the language that allows for giving greater rights under the contract at NYU. So I'm going to drop this share screen, turn it over to Gary.
Yeah, so that's a perfect setup. Bill Bill and I have known each other a lot of years, so it's really nice to be able to easily move this way. So I'm going to circle back to what Bill was just saying, but I want to start with something you introduced us with, Steve, which is you have familiarity with some of these issues because you were a graduate student. So here's where the graduate students and postdocs have really taken the lead, and a lot of non-tenure track units have sort of picked that up. And that is, there's not, to my knowledge, there's virtually not a grad employee campaign or a postdoc campaign in the country that not only has that non-discrimination language, but that is negotiating for independent external arbitration, right? Institutions have these internal, oh, trust us, we've got this internal process that'll take care of sexual harassment. Well, all my degrees are from UCLA. We know how that worked at UCLA. We know how that worked at Michigan State for sexual harassment. We know how that worked at Michigan. And I think you might have a few examples at USC of how those internal processes have not really worked very well. So as Bill said, it's very standard to have the non-discrimination clauses. What the grad employees and postdocs have done, as he was alluding to, is take the next step into really putting teeth into arbitration. So it's independent external. It's not that it goes up to a person within the institution and they have the final say. So that's absolutely critical. And I think what you're seeing is as the workforce changes, the issues that it negotiates change. And we've had this conversation at Bill's conference, which is a labor management conference. And basically where we've come out on it is the new bread and butter, like bread and butter's salaries, benefits, hours of work and the like. This is the new bread and butter because the workforce is more diverse and these are part of their basic bread and butter working conditions. I don't want to be discriminated against. I want to have lactation stations. I want to have restrooms that are accessible to me, right? All these things are central. And I think, again, the vanguard and the leadership of both the contingent faculty, but also in this case, the grad employees and postdocs has fundamentally changed that. So to the points that Bill was pointing to, just on the sort of bread and butter issue, that Professors in the Gig Economy has a really cool chapter by the author with another co-author in which they track between 2010 and 2016 the salary increases for the new adjunct faculty units. In that chapter, they focus only on adjunct faculty units. What they found is that they won salary increases at every institution. They were really significant salary increases. It can be, because it's often lifting the floor. It's not just a percentage increase. It's like, let's raise the floor to a certain minimum. And 89% of the contracts include provisions allowing part-time faculty to receive health insurance, like the most bread and butter of all, right? And so I've extended that in my analysis to just update it to more recent contracts and contracts for both full and part-time non-tenure track faculty, and the gains are extraordinary. So when you read the Management 101, well, it's not necessarily the case that you'll get an increase. That's just bullshit. So dramatic increases in the lifting of the floor, but then also percentage increases because there's a big variation in salaries among faculty. So some people think, well, they're going to lift the floor, but so what? I'm not getting paid terribly. So they're also negotiating cost of living percentage increases on the baseline. So what I ran into when I would knock doors is, so the union's going to level down salaries? No. It's going to lift the bottom and it's going to provide increases on whatever your base is. And it's not going to prevent you from negotiating on your own. Like if you get a job offer from UCLA, Steve, and say, oh, UCLA's hot on me, it doesn't prevent you, if you have a union, from doing that negotiation. Okay. On professional development, I'm really glad Bill put that slide up because that's an area where adjunct and full-time non-tenure track faculty have been extraordinarily successful. Some of the provisions are like the one at NYU, which is a total amount, and then you compete for it. Other provisions are a per faculty amount. And all of them recognize that the institution should be investing in the professional development of its employees. Like if you care about quality, you should be investing in the professional development of your employees. So those gains are substantial. On job security, particularly for part-time faculty, here's where the organizing among in the private sector has had a huge impact. You plan over the summer, you're going to teach a class, and the first day of classes starts, and they say, oh, sorry, don't need you, there aren't enough students. And you're left out in the cold. Because the presumption is too bad. We don't have to explain, we don't have to give you any compensation. Almost all the adjunct faculty contracts and the joint agreement contracts now have a class cancellation fee clause. So it's a recognition, you put time in, and that fee can vary, and it's not huge, but it's a disincentive to management to act as if you're just-in-time employees. And this is another area where the adjunct faculty and contingent faculty movement's been successful. Just in time is not just in time for the faculty, and it's not just in time for the students. Like you should have access to the resources you need for the class, access to the course management system, access to the library, access to office space, access to previous syllabi. All that stuff is laid out now in contracts. If you're a part-time faculty member, you get assigned a course. Here's the things you have a right to, right? Access to use the Xerox machine, right? The other one I'll just briefly mention is a lot of negotiation around distance education and your ability to do office hours online, your ability to not have to teach everything online if you don't want to, but to have that opportunity if you do. And also a lot of negotiation around evaluations. And I'm thinking in particular of a contract where they said, these are student surveys. They're not student evaluations because the students they're not in a position to fully evaluate us. They can say whether we're jerks, they can say whether we're biased, but they often can't really judge whether we understand the mathematics that we're teaching, for example, in an intro math class. So there's a lot of language on what's the process of evaluation, how student evaluations cannot be the only basis, how you can't just be dinged because one or two students didn't like you. And this is all based on what faculty unions have advanced at the table and elsewhere. It's all based on research, which Steve, you will know since you're in the field, is that evaluations are culturally biased. Who gets evaluated tougher? Women, people of color, as well as people teaching the required classes, which is what a lot of contingent faculty are teaching, right? So I'll stop there, sorry.
No, thank you so much for that. And I think both of your comments raise the equity issues, I think, inherent in the process that a unionization effort might address. So my next question is specifically around that. When we think about the adjunctification of higher ed and who hold those roles, I think as we think about the lack of representation in shared governance or inequities in resource distributions, those are also happening to folks who are already marginalized in higher education and society more broadly. So might you speak to how the collective bargaining process might address some of those issues? And if they haven't in some of the previous contracts, what advice you might provide to us at USC who are really committed to issues of equity and justice in higher education?
So it's a great question. And I just think that to underscore that's a point of unity is anti-discrimination. Because if you look at the scope of the categories that are protected can be protected under a collective bargaining agreement. You can basically be building power with an understanding that these are things that are going to be codified in the contract. So instead of people believing that they're discriminated against and having to go hire a lawyer and go to court, they're going to be able to go and have a provision in the contract which provides for grievance arbitration, like the NYU contract has grievance arbitration, so that goes all through the process at the institution, but then it goes outside to a third-party arbitrator. Very powerful tool in terms of fighting discrimination. But the other aspect that Gary mentioned, the California Faculty Association, they've negotiated even a step further with involving DEI and equity labor management committees to be working on these issues and about in terms of the hiring process, et cetera. Those things can also be accomplished through collective bargaining. And the question becomes, and I think I want to underscore another point, which is that, what the union is going to raise at the at the bargaining table after the union's in place is going to be based upon what faculty want. And so the beginning is the discussion of what faculty want and what I want to prioritize. And so prioritization about issues such as discrimination can then be put into the bargaining proposals and then pushed at the bargaining table. And again, it's a great source of unity because basically where we are today, particularly among contingent faculty, it's so important to have enforceable rights. And so I think that is a great question. I think that this is why unionization is so important at this time in particular.
So I'll just build on that. So a lot of the anti-discrimination clauses are obviously about individual rights, about individual discrimination. But what happens is, it's like the examples I was giving about what some units were negotiating in the pandemic. The reality is that the academic workforce becomes less diverse the higher up you move in the hierarchy, right? So tenured faculty, the least diverse, tenure track, assistant professors, a little more diverse, but not as diverse as full-time non-tenure track, and the most diverse of all are part-time faculty. So when that is your context, part of the negotiation is to recognize that status of employment is overlaid by other identities and vulnerabilities, and to negotiate accordingly. So like in the pandemic, who's getting disparately hit by COVID? What communities are being disparately hit? And those communities can have to do with race and ethnicity. They can have to do with gender and having to, being the primary caretaker, and therefore you're affected in a way that folks maybe who aren't caretakers are not. And so there are various mechanisms for negotiating that. And one really important one that may help you overcome the hurdle of some faculty about, well, I don't want this adversarial relationship of a union. It is very common to have, as Bill said, labor management committees. So you come together to the table, you recognize that we got some issues here we want to deal with. You can't come up with a solution for this round of negotiation, but you say, you know what, we're going to form a labor management committee, equal members on both. We both recognize there are equity issues we have on this campus. We're going to come back with a report, and then the next round of bargaining, we're going to operate on that. So that's a collaborative process, right? Where you're saying we recognize, but we can't figure it out this round, but we're going to figure it out. The third thing I'll say is, and I'm going back to the CFA again, the California Faculty Association, and this is starting to get negotiated in a few other places, is cultural taxation. So they have language in their contract recognizing differential advising that attaches to faculty of color, and also in some ways to women faculty who identify as women, or faculty who identify as queer. That they're going to have more students coming to them who aren't necessarily their students because they share some identity. So there's language in the contract that allows for those faculty to get additional credit, workload credit, for exceptional, above average, whatever workloads with regard to students. And again, as Bill said, and it bears repeating, this came out of internal discussions within the California Faculty Association, in which various caucuses were saying, look, no, I'm the only fill in the blank faculty member in this unit, in this whatever, and I got all these students who were coming to me. And we need some recognition of this cultural taxation, right? And so that bubbles up to, okay, the bargaining team then takes that forward.
Another area about inequities in that collective bargaining can be deal with is issues involving student food insecurity, housing insecurity, that unions can play a role in raising these issues at the bargaining table, seek to have labor management committees developed to be able to deal with those solutions, particularly involving those types of issues, but also other issues on campus dealing with in terms of equity. And so that's just another thing, again, coming through. It depends on what the faculty, what you want when you're developing proposals that will then be presented to management at the bargaining table.
There's also salary equity clauses in most contracts.
Great. Thank you so much for your insights around those issues. I see a question from my colleague over in social work. Go ahead.
Bill and Gary, thank you. This has been so insightful and informative. The question that I have, it really connects to what you were just focusing on, but wanting to give a little bit more specificity, especially when our colleagues are wondering what's the benefit of unionization and just grappling with their fears and concerns. So could you share with our colleagues what else you've seen in terms of professional development that has been negotiated during collective bargaining and workload support, specifically anything you've seen around sabbaticals and teaching load reductions, I think are key issues that faculty have concerns about.
You want to start, Bill?
Yeah, well, just on the professional development, I think there are really two models. One is a pot for everyone that gets distributed. The other is per faculty. And then the question then becomes is the amount that's applied. And that goes to the question of what's being negotiated and what can be accomplished in that. And those are really, I think, the two models on that, maybe with some procedures tied with it. On the question of workload, and cost reduction, that's certainly something that is negotiated, depending on the nature of what people are doing and what the basis is for the cost reduction. That is certainly possible. And then the sabbatical issue for non-tenure track faculty is a real one. I'm not sure right now, Gary may know whether or not that's been accomplished yet, but that's certainly something on the horizon that you're going to see non-tenure track faculty, particularly the full-time tenure track faculty, seeking. But I think that that's certainly a goal that collective bargaining should be aimed towards.
So there are, I'll start with the last one. We actually have implemented in our institution, we're not collective bargaining. We do have a union. It's a minority union without collective bargaining. Leaves for full-time non-tenure track faculty. We call them career track, which is sort of in parallel to sabbaticals, with the idea, as Bill had said earlier, maybe there's a new instructional technology you want to get up, you want to redo your course or whatever. And so there are those there's a few examples like that, but what's much more common is to get professional development money to develop a course, right? To have a set of materials that you're going to develop and use at a later point. It's totally common to have class size caps. And to the issue, so I'm looking at Amanda and I'm thinking of all the variations in loads because we were talking about this beforehand, to have those calibrated to different types of classes, lab classes for people in science, clinicians who have to, maybe in social work or in education or somewhere else, go out and visit folks in the field, right? So it's, I mean, the level of detail sometimes in contracts may seem stunning, but an overall class cap including class caps on distance education. So you're not, technology is not a way to quadruple your class size without changing your pay. To ensure that your course load is in your contract, so you can't have your course load increased. Class caps, so they can't totally increase the size of the class. And then vary those caps according to the type of class. Is it a, like I said, is it a lab? Is it a, and so on. So that's actually a pretty common thing as well.
And
Thank
then
you.
we'll take one more question before we transition to our next segment. Go ahead.
Thank you. Quick question. So we were talking about this, clinical faculty I've been organizing clinical faculty a lot, and they can see the benefits of a union generally because they've worked in hospitals that have unions or whatever. Where I'm really running into issues is with research faculty. And I'm just curious if you can speak to some of the gains that research faculty have won in contracts that are different from the general raises and benefits and those kinds of things. Like how do I sell this to a researcher who doesn't think that they're worried that they're on soft money, and that's just if they get a raise, then they have to get more grants. They have to work harder for that money. Just curious how you've overcome that, or if you can speak to any of the kind of different benefits that you've seen them win in that regard.
Sorry, go ahead, Gary.
Well, you just articulated, you're talking about a med school, and they have to make their salary. Right?
Yeah.
Right? They have to raise their salary because the baseline stipend is so ridiculously low. That actually, we're talking before we started, that the first place I helped organize was a health center in Connecticut. And one of the things that they were fighting against was the ongoing reduction of what that baseline was. So the first thing you say to someone who's a research faculty member who's basically living on the soft money they raise is that you can negotiate increases in that minimum, right? And you can also negotiate, levels of support that are important to you as a faculty member doing research. So just like there's working conditions that support what teaching faculty do, there are working conditions that support what research faculty do. And so I think there's some parallels like that. I think there's much less, it's a less defined workload, as you're sort of suggesting. But what's happened in medical schools, and it's just going to get worse, is hypercapitalism, where you're essentially treated like you're an independent contractor. So negotiation over lab space is important, right? And again, that is something you can negotiate in a contract, and it's a lot better if it's negotiated in a contract, just like office space for teaching faculty, than if you're left as an individual to say, wait a minute, don't take my office space, I'm just in between grants.
One of the things to keep in mind on this topic is that, there's always been a stereotype for a long time that people in STEM would be less inclined to support unionization. And what we're finding is, based on the electoral outcomes involving postdocs and grad students as well as faculty, is that stereotype is incorrect. That actually some of the strongest people supporting unionization are people in STEM. And so part of that is to figure out and develop them as being very much involved with the organizing efforts. And for research scientists, I think you look at what's happening with the postdocs, where they have been organizing at a rapid rate all over the country, including at USC recently, as you know. So I think that that's an important element. And the question then becomes, what is pushing the institution to provide the resources that they have to bolster what is being provided through grants? And that's what's happening with the postdocs, is moving towards insisting that the institution put the money in to that, so that there's greater regularity. And ultimately, it helps the university by doing that, because it stabilizes the research rather than having people who is in such a concerned state about raising funds for their own salaries. So I think that this is a good issue to be able to be pushing and emphasizing that as a research institution, the university is obligated to provide resources for those faculty who are hired to do the research.
They're basically privatizing the cost of doing research by shifting it to be the responsibility of the faculty. So just like a teaching faculty member can say, I need to have access to this, this, and this to do my research, the same thing with the research faculty.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thanks. I wish we could upend this whole soft money thing altogether somehow, but maybe we can, start the process with this
What
union
proportion of their salary do they have to raise?
up to 95%, depending on the school.
Yeah, so you can negotiate that.
Yeah.
That's the point, right? Like say, okay, we're going to change that to 90% or 85, whatever it is.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Thank you all for such a robust conversation. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Smith-Maddox over in social work to lead us in the next part of the conversation.
Thank you, Steve. Welcome everyone to our last segment of this very informative town hall. And indeed, what we have learned thus far has been, as Steve just said, robust. I'm Renee Smith-Maddox. I'm a teaching professor at the DeWarwick Peck School of Social Work. And in this particular segment, we get an opportunity to reconnect to some of the realities of campaigning and being specifically moving on the path of unionization. So we're going to explore strategies for combating anti-union campaigns and retaliation while discussing how faculty can craft effective messaging to build community. And in this case, I'm going to specifically talk about how we name our faculty here at USC, and that's RTPC faculty, that's research, teaching, practitioner, and clinical faculty. It is the same as non-tenured faculty and contingent faculty in other universities, but I want our colleagues to know we're speaking to them. And we want to really help our colleagues understand that what we're doing is relevant to them and to their future as faculty. What is happening at private institutions, we're seeing union growth, and we're seeing it for a reason. But we're also seeing opposition efforts, and they're becoming more sophisticated. And typically these tactics center on what could or what would happen in worst case scenarios if we had a union. We're also hearing information or perspectives that explain the possible downsides of unionizations. And we're seeing this in emails and in websites. Of course, all this feeds into the fare, which is all reasonable, that any one of our colleagues can have as they see this type of messaging. We continue our discussion with Gary Rhodes and Bill Herbert, and their combined expertise sheds light on the whole academic labor and institutional change that's occurring through unionization. And they are going to provide us insights and strategies because they've seen a lot and they know a lot. To not only fight against anti-union efforts, but to also build a unified faculty voice. So Gary and Bill, thank you again for being here. This is round 3. Some of the things you've touched upon, but we can do a deeper dive. So I think I'll just kick us off in just, can you shed light on how do we counteract anti-union narratives and demonstrate the positive impact of collective bargaining for RTPC faculty?
Well,
So I'll just,
okay,
go ahead, Bill.
I was just going to say that I think one of the first things is to start functioning as a union. before collective bargaining, a unit of, when I say a union, I'm saying a collective voice. And the collective voice is being one that brings everyone in together so that we're working with everyone, and making sure that everyone feels a part of this effort. And that includes people who may be not necessarily have signed a card, an authorization card, but actually are interested in it, and bringing them in and talk about what's possible in terms of the vision for the future. And I think that's a really important segment, because frequently in higher ed, as we know, people can be left aside and not be seen or ignored. And that one of the things about unionization and bringing people to feel strong is to make sure that they understand that we're in it together, as opposed to it being unsure of what this means. And so, I mean, one of the typical anti-union messages is that the union is a third party. I'm sure that's part of the messaging that's being received. Well, the best defense against that is for the union to function as it really is, which is a representative. It doesn't have to be certified. That'll eventually happen. It has to be a representative to show that it is already there, and that people are there, and it's growing, and a sense of motion and movement in a positive direction. I think that's really a first start on that. Gary, do you want to proceed?
Yeah, so it's the quality argument. It's the Chicken Little argument. Oh my God, we're going to unionize and the whole place is going to go to shit. So Bill, if you pull up the institutions that have unionized non-tenure track faculty, while you're doing that, I'll say, I know it's not a private university, but the University of California has had non-tenure track and the equivalent of your RTPC, both full and part-time non-tenure track, has had those faculty unionized for a couple decades. I'm not aware of any decline in the quality of the University of California over the past 2 decades. Then you run down this list. Tufts has had adjunct faculty unionized for at least 10 years. Wash U, right? These are not institutions for the most part, starting at the top, Chicago, Harvard. These are not downwardly mobile institutions. So it's just a silly argument. Okay, and all you need to do is present them with, here's the places that have unionized, and anyone who's concerned, and say, do these appear to you to be downwardly mobile institutions? So this is an argument that management has used about unions for a couple decades. And the more places that unionize, and the thing about the privates that unionize is there's a lot of really prestigious places that have been unionizing. It doesn't hold water. So that's the first thing I would say, because the same thing happens in the public sector. Oh, we organized at Oregon. Oh my God, if we unionize, we won't be a member of the Association of American Universities. And I said, here's the institutions that are unionized and that are AAU institutions, Research One institutions. Here's when they unionized. They all unionized 5 to 10 to 15 years before they became an AAU institution. So apparently it didn't compromise their ability to become quality, even more high quality institutions. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, this is an area where, and Steve will know this, working with Adriana and there are others. Cecile Sam did a piece with Adriana some years ago, about a decade ago. There's just absolutely no doubt. There's plenty of empirical data about the inverse relationship between student outcomes and crappy working conditions for faculty. And that is a pretty substantial quantitative research database. And you have the added benefit of a person, at Rossier, who is one of the contributors to that literature, Adriana. And her whole pitch has been, as has been the pitch of others in this field, faculty working conditions are students' learning conditions. If the working conditions are terrible, if people don't have offices, if they can't be having private conversations with students, it's not good for the students. And there's data to back that up, which sort of gets to the the question about collaborations with tenure track faculty, I think you've got a good start with Adriana. I assume there's some other tenure track folks who can say, look, there's actually data on this. Adriana's done case studies, multiple case studies, and there's a much larger literature as well. But the one I would just add that that's not on your questions is the students. And I kind of started out with that saying you're not contingent to them. Our TPC folks are not peripheral to the students and the professions. And what has been really valuable in almost all these campaigns is that student groups align themselves with the faculty. Because what they do is they find out, wait a minute, the person who's teaching me at a university who's, what's the tuition now at USC?
100,000.
Yeah, okay. So the person who's teaching me at an institution that's charging me tuition, room, and board that's $100,000 is making what? And then the next question is, where's that money going? And so most of these campaigns have been very effective at saying, we generate this proportion of credit hours and we get only this proportion of the budget. And that just puts everyone on the defensive in management because the students are saying, where's my money going? I want my money to go to the people who actually are teaching me, right? Or I want my money to be going to the people who are doing the work of generating the research, not all these people who, where's the rest of the money going? I don't get it. So part of your story can be your allies telling your story for you. Yeah, one of my favorite teachers, an RTPC faculty member, person who made a huge difference in my professional life as an RTPC faculty member, person who does incredible work in this field of research as an RTPC faculty member. And so I think it's important to inoculate, which is the language that labor uses, against the sort of management 101, first by just saying it's silly. There's just no evidence. In fact, the evidence is to the contrary.
And I think one of the other aspects of empirical evidence would be utilizing a directory and showing, as I was showing before with the table of contents from the NYU contract, to say, well, you can use all the scare tactics you want. As Gary said, it's silly, but reality is look what's been accomplished at other institutions. And I think that's sort of an important element of it. The other thing I wanted to raise, which deals with something that Jane McAlevey talks about in her book, No Shortcuts, the late great Jane McAlevey, No Shortcuts. She talked about the necessity of developing stress tests, of basically creating events in which people who feel comfortable coming forward and showing their support for the union during an organizing campaign. And that's sometimes, and obviously we talked about how part-time faculty may be concerned and fearful, but one of the real powerful messages is when people start standing up and go public. And I don't know where, it's at the right time, but having real events to show that the level of support where people are standing up, and that gives other people the strength to come forward. And again, that's another way of not sending out a responsive email, but rather showing demonstrative evidence based on an event or a photograph of people saying, yes, I'm with the union. And that's actually being used on campaigns now regularly, of having pictures of people from various places in a campaign, in a university, from various departments saying, yes, I'm supportive of this unionization drive. I think it helps everyone get a sense of solidarity and support and comfort.
The student newspaper is also a good place to place stuff and to talk about, just to raise some questions. How is it that we ask students to pay this much money? And the promise that underlies that ask is that if you get your advanced degree, you get your bachelor's degree, and then if you get a master's and a doctorate, the world is going to be your oyster. And here's the pay of the average RTPC faculty member, and you could break it down by full and part-time. It's a lie. Like, it's a living lie in the students' faces. And for the students, they care about you. They don't care about some assistant vice provost to an associate vice provost to a whatever, right? They care about you. You're the ones that are in their faces. Or you're their clinician, or you're their, whatever it is in the medical school. And so I think the more, as Bill's saying, the more you can have some public, you can even just ask questions. What proportion of the budget goes to RTPC faculty? What proportion of the credit hours and the research are done by RTPC faculty? Those are empirical questions, and they're going to fall in your favor.
Thank you. I want to see if there's any questions that my colleagues might have.
I appreciate your comment around like involving the student newspaper, or really thinking about this process as you called it, community building, or as I might think in an organizing framework, coalition building. I guess, are there other constituencies that come to mind for you that you've seen outside of the student newspaper activating student voice? Are there other constituencies that you might advise us to think about in this process of community and coalition building?
Absolutely. You're in Bill's in a labor-friendly state, a labor-rich state and city. You are in a labor-rich, intensive state. You got unions all around you. They will support what you're doing if you reach out to them. That's the first thing.
And one of the first places to go are the new unions at USC. So having graduate assistants and postdocs, your eyes and ears of what's going on, they can provide nice, important intelligence besides showing support that you want to be able to tap into. And then besides the labor community is the political community.
Yes.
And look at what happened, the campaigns that happened at USC and elsewhere, in which politicians from the LA area came forward to show support, and have those lined up with letters from the politicians. So, and there, I forget who the state assembly speaker is now. I think it was someone from the LA area. But regardless, finding the politicians in the area, the mayor, the assembly, the Senate, having those people sign letters saying, either together or separately, that they support your campaign because it's a campaign for justice, that will be very, very powerful messaging, not just politically, not just publicly, but for the institution to hear.
Yeah. So I know there's red spots in the blue state, but when the UC workers struck, Katie Porter led a delegation of 19 congressional delegates and wrote to the president of the UC system, settle the strike. These are your students. That matters. It matters a lot. So internally, as Bill said, start with the folks who just unionized. Start with whatever other unions, whether it's custodial workers or hospitality workers or groundskeeper, whatever it is. Local labor councils are really important. And community groups as well. Like you're situated in a city that cares about USC and is going to be shocked. Most working class people, when they find out what RTPC equivalent faculty make, are like, what? Or they find out that someone who's part-time has no health care. What? Aren't you working at that wealthy place, USC, that keeps dispossessing people in neighborhoods, has all, boatloads of money, and they can't afford to pay the people teaching their students? What's going on there?
Another comparative, though, to reach out to would be the lecturers unit at the University of California, which represent the lecturers at UCLA. And their contract, which I didn't include, would be another example of some of the things that have been accomplished. And then you have a comparative in the same city and have them participate, asking their leadership to come forward and provide assistance, and their rank and file at UCLA to come forward. Another bridge for solidarity.
Yeah, Mia McIver, it's a different union, but unions are all supportive of each other. So Mia McIver of the UC lecturers is fabulous. And yeah, absolutely agree.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. again, another rich, robust, informative segment. And some of the key takeaways was, the power of functioning as a collective voice leads to coalition building and across all segments. You talked about the power of reaching out to other unions in the state, other universities, but more than that, the political community here in California, in Los Angeles in particular, where we can get community groups to support our efforts, first of all, to be aware of it, and then ultimately to support it. RTPC faculty has to realize that we are the essential workers here.
Right.
And that this is an opportunity to function as a collective voice. Private institutions, as you have stated, that have unionized, they're still alive and well and making money. They have not moved into a downward mobility trajectory. They're just doing very well. I think the powerful thing that you have shared with us also is that the faculty work conditions constitutes the student learning outcomes and their conditions as well. Solidarity and support is what's going to see our effort through. So I hear you. It's advocating, reaching out in all spectrums, and working with students. Using the vehicles and the outlets that are before us. Thank you, thank you, thank you for this segment. I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Laura, so she can close out this wonderful town hall. Laura?
Yeah, thank you everyone who was on this call. Thank you to Professors Herbert and Rhodes, of course. Just to reemphasize the key takeaways, unionization and faculty wins, I think we came away with some very specific wins, especially I think the document on the PowerPoint with the links to some of these wins, because I've had faculty come to me and say, I've done my research that shows unions are bad. Now we have evidence to show that they are wrong. Putting everything in a national context, we can show, which universities, nationally ranked universities, longtime places with longtime unions like the UCs that have obviously not been diminished by unions, that we can use to show the power of unions. We know what the challenges of organizing unions are, but we know how to fight them, I hope. We can gather strength, as Professor Smith-Maddox just said, reaching out to our fellow union organizers and politicians, and perhaps media, including student media, to tell our stories. But I think for me, that what really resonated was the message that at the center of organizing is respect, and that RTPC contingent adjunct faculty deserve respect. We are doing a lot of the heavy duty lifting and the work, and we hope we can continue to spread that message. So thank you to everyone who was here today, and let's keep up the good work.
Well, thank
Can I
you
have
for joining us.
one last thought about management? They will say to you, if they haven't already, if we give you raises, we'll have to raise tuition. So there's an easy thought experiment. You haven't gotten raises in recent years. Has tuition gone up?
Well, USC tuition always goes up by a lot. So
Yeah, that's the point. It's independent of your salaries. Good luck to you. And always, as Bill and I said to Jen and Corinne when we had a private meeting before, we're always happy to come back if you think it'd be valuable at some point in the future. So you're doing great work. Good luck to you.
Thanks again for inviting us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Thank you. That was great.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.